Well, but more importantly than my personal things are the fact that our next speaker is Christopher Lever, who's Emeritus Professor of Plant Science at St. John's College at Oxford University, and has the unique distinction of being a good friend of Barry Blumberg's when he was there with Balliol College. But in addition to that, he is going to be addressing achieving food security and sustainability for 9 billion, and is involved in the molecular biology as well as this, and as well as botany. And because of that connection, he is going to tell you which cake is which at the end of his talk.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here and have the honor of addressing you this morning. As you will realize, we probably didn't coordinate our talks as much as we should have done, so there'll be a certain element of repetition, but it's a good thing. I was always told when you lecture to students, you should say what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you told them, and that's the way forward. The other thing is, it's also, I was made aware that this symposium, this whole meeting is in honor of Barry Blumberg. We were not close friends, but I met him on a number of occasions in Oxford. I dined with him because not only did I teach him biology, I also used to teach him biochemistry. And he, as you well know, was a very long-time friend of Oxford, and we miss him as much as I'm sure all of you do. So, again, I would like to dedicate this small contribution to him. Could we take the lights down a little, please? I've begun with a proverb, an old Byzantine proverb, which I think encapsulate something which, no doubt, following speaker will say something. He who has bread may have troubles. He who lacks it has only one. Think about it. The other thing is, this is just one of these few moving pictures that I've managed to get hold of, which shows the way in which green plants flower, leaf throughout the growing season. Human beings, of which we're one species, we are one species among many millions on the planet, we actually use about 30% of all the photosynthetic productivity captured from the sun. And we do this by a process called, the plants do this by a process called photosynthesis. And we've got to think about sharing that with the rest of the environment at some point. We also use about 30% of the planet, about 12% cropland, 20% pasture to feed us. What level is truly sustainable? How much do we need to share with other species, maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem surfaces? And how can we increase and optimize what we have harvested at the moment? I just briefly want to mention agriculture. It's probably the most important event in human history, and I think it's really center stage and should be at the top of our priorities at the moment. It's critical to the future of our planet and humanity, and is part of the knowledge-based bioeconomy of the 21st century. If we turn the clock back 100 generations, 5,000 years, it was key to the establishment of all modern civilization, including your own country. And, you know, one of the major problems today, availability of food, water, energy, is likely to be the major forces of global conflict, and I could show you slides on that. So the role of agriculture is back at center stage. Decisions we and our political masters take now will shape our planet in terms of species competition, biogeochemistry, and utility to society in the future. We're very much dependent on cultivated plant species, very few of them in fact, as the software to translate the sun's energy, water, and mineral nutrients into food, fiber, and potentially fuels. So the sun is the only renewable source of energy, and green plants are the only organisms capable of capturing that. Now, agriculture is a success story and has kept pace with the increase in population over the centuries. The population has doubled since about 1960 in the last 50 years, but we do produce enough people to farm them. But if you look at farming, this is the view that most Europeans have of what farming is like. There's a big disconnect. And this is a picture of the time. It's very different. Most people don't know where their food comes from. This is the reality of modern prairie agriculture in parts of North America and certainly in South America. These are combine harvesters harvesting soybean, and right behind they're planting corn. So these are the major multinational incorporated. This is the reality of African agriculture. It's very different, small scale, it's mainly women. So today we could feed everyone on the planet thanks to plant breeding and modern agriculture. But now and in the future, the major challenge, of course, is to make sure everyone has enough to eat. And again, this is repetition. You've heard that 1 billion people go hungry daily. About 250 million of these are in sub-Saharan Africa. About 30,000 people, half of them children, die every day due to hunger and nutrition. 30,000 in a day. More than 3 billion people are living in absolute poverty on less than $2 a day. And countries tend to move what they define as poverty, depending on their economic situation, and are generally deficient in at least one nutrient necessary for the maintenance of their health. They've got real problems with food security. And a lot of poor people live in rural areas. And one thing I've noticed from being in India and China this year, most of the farmers I met were really quite old, as they are in many of our own countries. And their major problem is their kids don't want to go ahead and do farming. They want to go to urban cities and buy iPods and iPads and have the good life. So current food supplies depend on technology. This is the increase in food productivity over the last so many years. This is the amount of land which is committed to agriculture. It's increased about 10%. But this increase in productivity has been due to many things. Mechanization, inputs of energy, tractors, harvesting, irrigation, the Haber-Bosch process, which converts gas, oil into nitrogen fertilizer, which was one of the bases of the Green Revolution. Crop protection chemicals. We use a very large amounts of agrochemicals. Better seeds, plant breeding, conventional and improved. 40% of the world's food would not exist without crop protection, agrochemicals, hybridization, enhanced plant breeding, and nowadays GM. So this is why we're in this position today. But this has been at a cost. To feed and resource 7 billion people, which was the number which the UN decided were on the planet at the end of October, we've lost about 1/5 of our topsoil due to erosion, desertification and salinity, as we've heard earlier, about 1/5 of our agricultural land due to overgrazing and the creation of marginal land, and about 1/3 of our forests, which are sinks for carbon dioxide. Additionally, we've got quite significant environmental pollution because modern agriculture, particularly prairie agriculture, is very polluting. We've got climate change, groundwater depletion, depletion of the ozone layer, which seems to ebb and flow, massive fossil fuel usage, CO2 increased by at least 15% since 1950, species extinction, biodiversity loss. We don't know all the species on the Earth, but we're losing a large number of them. We don't know about their utility, and their right is just as high as ours live. Urbanization, increased meat consumption, which we've heard about, obesity and starvation, a whole range of diseases which we know well, which with globalization spread. This is unsustainable, and doing nothing really is not an option. And it's not doing nothing now, not doing nothing in the future, it's doing something now. So the challenges you've heard about, the population 7 billion will be north of 9 billion by 2050. 50% of the world population already live in urban areas, and this will rise to 70%. The largest increases in population will occur in Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of South America. Increasing affluence really is driving the demand for meat. And when you think about 70% of all the cereals and soybeans we harvest are fed to meat, to animals which produce meat, you realize. You've heard the statistic about Hungary and poverty. The amount of land available for agriculture will stay constant or decrease. And then, of course, we've got the problem of water security. Climate warming, depending on who you believe, is probably going to be neutral, but will have very negative effects on sub-Saharan Africa and those parts of the world where the population increase will be quite large. It will also lead to a whole range of new diseases moving around the world, rising sea levels, flooding, severe drought in other places, and of course, unless we can reverse it, as we've heard, problems with the soil. Increases in yields of most major crops are starting to plateau. All the science and technology that we put in so far for the major tradable staple crops, and they're rice and corn and soybean and wheat, we're getting plateauing. Although the levels in the developed world are really quite high in terms of yield, in other parts of the world they're much lower. So there's room to increase local increases in productivity. The diversion of resources into growing energy crops with biofuels rather than food crops. Interesting statistics. The amount of maize, or corn as you call it, you need to produce a tank full of ethanol for your modern 4x4 is enough to feed a family of about 4 people in sub-Saharan Africa for a whole year. So this is a problem. So we require 70 to 100% more food on the same land area with improved sustainability, which I'll come back to, fairer distribution and adaptation to climate change. Now, the food system is failing on this term, sustainability. It's defined as meeting the needs of the present while improving the sustainability of ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So agriculture, as you've heard, currently consumes about 70% of global water withdrawals from rivers and aquifers, many of which are being dramatically overexploited and decreasing markedly. Global water demand for agriculture could rise by over 30% by 2030 and double by 2050. And a lot of the major agricultural systems are rain-fed as opposed to irrigated. 11.5 billion hectares of vegetated land on the earth, around 24%, as I've said, have undergone human-induced soil degradation. We've got to try and reverse this. It won't be easy and it won't be cheap. And the other thing is, as we've heard, agriculture, particularly mechanized agriculture and high-input agriculture with agrochemicals and fertilizers and forestry contribute about 30% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gases emissions. So we must grow more with less. And this term has been coined sustainable intensification. All commentators, I think, agree that food production will have to increase substantially, but there are different views on how this can be achieved. Intensification is defined as producing, as I said, more output from the same area of land while reducing the negative environmental impacts. And agriculture and environmental impacts are contradictory in one sense, but as you heard from Per earlier, we've got to address it. To deliver sustainable intensification, we must go beyond pointless arguments based on entrenched belief, depending on who you represent, or narrow debates about the individual technologies, and must focus on the desired outcomes. Practical matters, not just an academic exercise. There's no single perfect solution. Sustainability is a journey, not the destination. Solutions must work locally for individual farmers and communities and not just the developed world. I'm not going to tell you that science and technology has all the answers. I am going to tell you that modern technology and science may make a contribution in the appropriate deployment in the world. So conventional plant breeding has been incredibly successful. This is the US average yield increases for a number of major crops: soybean, sorghum, wheat, and corn. It's all been going up. But, and I didn't continue the graph, it's starting to plateau. It's starting to plateau, particularly in those crops like wheat, which haven't benefited from the appropriate deployment of GM technologies. Corn's still going up, but as we're hearing, it's 1 or 2% a year, and it's starting to significantly plateau. So in future, if agriculture is to support everyone adequately on the planet, we need a combination of improved and appropriate technologies. I'm not going to go into them, but you've probably heard of some of them. Integrated pest management. We lose 40% of all our crops because of competition with weeds, insect pests, viruses, fungi, bacteria in the world, despite the use of heavy agrochemicals in the developed world. We've got to reduce our input of chemistry and energy. We've got to move from chemical solutions to biological solutions. We've obviously got to use water conservation. We've got to develop no-till practices, reduce mechanization, precision agriculture where appropriate, which is quite possible, as we heard, in the developed world, but probably much more difficult in the so-called developing world. We need to conserve genetic diversity. We don't know what genes we're going to need. We tend to look at just a few crops in terms of improvement and breeding. There are a lot of so-called, orphan crops which have been neglected. And those of you that have heard the output from the UN this week are talking about cassava, which produces about 30% of the calorific intake in many countries in Africa and other parts of Southeast Asia. It's being devastated by a virus attack which destroys the tubers and also above the leaves. There are solutions to this. Conventional plant breeding hasn't come up to them, but the Danforth Center and a number of other people in the US have developed transgenic approaches to solving the virus problem. So we've got to look at so-called orphan crops, not just the tradable crops. Genetic modification by so-called marker-assisted breeding of conventional plant breeding and GM technology where appropriate. I am not, and it has been oversold, GM is not a silver bullet, but I believe that appropriately used in the right area with other approaches, it has a role. So basically what we're talking about is building increased productivity and sustainability into the seed by plant breeding and biotechnology. Genetic modification by marker-assisted breeding, which I'll explain a bit later, and GM technology where appropriate. The scientific basis of all crop improvement is the identification of the genes that encode and regulate specific phenotypic characteristics or traits of use to the farmer. So what does this mean? Because of the advancing technologies, you know that the human genome is being sequenced and many other genomes, the genetic information which determines what an organism looks like. Increasingly, a large number of crops have been sequenced, so we know what the gene complement is, and we know what a lot of these genes do. And it's now so cheap, you can sequence a genome in a few days for $1,000, as opposed to Craig Venter, which cost millions. On this microscope slide, I have 30,000 genes represented. They've been spotted onto it, and you can use this for analysis to see when genes are switched on and off. It's the same number of genes that you and I have. In fact, many of our genes are in common with higher plants. But with this sort of technology, it's revolutionizing how we can identify the genes. So I don't want to go into the details, but there's a lot of high-throughput sequencing. There's ways using these chips. What it's saying is we're getting incredible amounts of information. We're starting to understand which gene, or increasingly which group of genes, determine the trait. So that's the only humor I'm going to use. The major problem is we've got bioinformation overload. The secret is to identify which genes using a whole variety of techniques so that you can identify select genes which confer disease resistance, increased productivity, water use efficiency, whatever. And this very busy slide actually identifies how this modern technology is being used. The aim, of course, is to more sustainable production, but the area I'll talk about is reduced stresses. Plants, when you grow them, are seldom grown in an ideal environment. They may be stressed for water. It may be too hot. It may be too cold. It may be too saline. It may be there are a lot of rather nasty metals in the ground. It may be there's an infestation of pests, competition with weeds. So these are called biotic and abiotic stresses. So this is the one area which is being concentrated on with the technology. In the future, we're starting to look at improved plant performance. We've heard of water use efficiency. How can you get more crop per drop? Nutrient use efficiency. How can we optimize the uptake of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and other nutrients which the plant needs vitally, which we apply as fertilizers, whether organic or inorganic, the vast majority of which gets washed into the watercourses and causes eutrophication, algal biomass growing up in the Gulf of Mexico and so on. Improved nutrition and health. Plants don't produce seeds and that which we harvest for our benefit. They do it for themselves. We've domesticated them over time, and it's taken, as you've heard, 5,000 years. But we can start both breeding and selecting and managing plants so that they are better able to provide the nutrients and calories we require. And then, of course, there's a potential for new industries. We can already make oral vaccines in plants. They're being tested at the moment. And there are a lot of other things. Because when the fuel runs out and you no longer can drive your large motor cars in this country, we're going to have to use plants to make the polymers and the other components that we require using the sun's energy. Genetic modification in agriculture today, the first step. The first the first GM crops were grown in the US about 15 years ago. The main plants that were modified, corn leads the way, but also soybean, cotton, and canola, oilseed rape. The first generation GM plants, and I won't go into how it was done, were plants which are of obvious benefit to the producer, to the agrochemical company, to the seed company, and to the farmer. So these were mainly so-called input traits. They actually have had major financial, economic, and I could even argue environmental benefits. They've all been fully tested and have been shown to have no health downside and no environmental downside. But this was very much a first generation. It was single genes. Global area of biotech crops introduced in 1996. Worldwide, we've got something like 15 million farmers in 29 countries. They planted about 150 million hectares, 365 million acres in 2010, about 10% or 40 million hectares year on year. Many of these farmers, the vast majority, are small-scale farmers, Southeast Asia, India, and so on. And you can see the increases. So this is the global here. This is the increase in the so-called industrial developing, and this is the developing nations. And you see the deployment around the world. North, South America, parts of India, parts of China, parts of Australia and South Africa. Notice the large gap in Europe. We might come back to that later. Genetically modified crops in the USA. Well, you will have all been eating GM crops because they form the basis of processed food. You will also have eaten meat which has been fed on GM soybean and cereal. But the vast majority of these crops, and you can see the percentage of total production, is genetically modified to be herbicide resistant, primarily to a herbicide called Roundup or glyphosate, or resistant to insect pests by putting in several genes encoded from a soil-borne bacterium. These were relatively quick fixes, but they've turned out to be very beneficial. So the first benefits, growers, and the trait benefits, growers and value chain. So this is the introduction here. This is yield increases, the supply is more secure, percentage of acres planted to the trait. So this was the first generation, insect and herbicide resistance, because this is, and it also meant that we didn't have to use as much in the way of agrochemicals. Second generation, more sophisticated, and they're starting to stack these traits together. So you can build in insect resistance and glyphosate resistance into the same crop. The next generation are the output traits. The first one in the US is actually being to modify corn so it can produce ethanol by genetic engineering and other means to fuel your motor cars. Improve feeds for animals, increasing the protein content and so on. The more advanced ones, and this is the ones where we're going to be moving towards, are water optimization, water use efficiency, increasing yield by a number of techniques, fertilizer utilization, and nutraceuticals. So environmental and sustainability benefits of the first generation I've listed. I won't go into detail, but there's certainly been a very significant upsides. Farmers are very clever people. They wouldn't use the technology unless it was to benefit, but it has been a great benefit. So simple traits have brought huge benefits, including the most cost-effective use of modern benign chemicals, no-till agriculture. You don't have to plow the field, degrade the soil and use energy. You can just plant straight through after you've grown the crop and killed what's left. Mankind depends on few crops. Most of them are on this slide. The tradable crops are the ones which sit on the high sea, and which people then use to generate the price volatility we talked about. So the application of both normal breeding by the conventional approach and GM technology has primarily been used for these staple tradable food crops, maize and soybean being obvious, wheat and rice. They should now be adapted to improving orphan crops, which can address food security and nutrition and provide economic benefits to poor farmers in developing countries. I'm talking about sorghum, cowpea, sweet potato, groundnut, cassava, etc. Many of these crops you won't know about. They are the staple diet in many of the developing countries. Now, marker-assisted breeding means once you've identified and sequenced all the genes in an organism, and you've identified which of those confer specific traits or benefits to the crop, you can use this to improve the rate of conventional plant breeding. So this will go on being important as well. But if you want to take genes from another organism or from a plant which doesn't reproduce sexually, then you will have to use the GM approach. I'm going to mention just a few in outline. More crop per drop. Drought is a major problem. Drought and flooding, in fact. You've heard about the problem in Thailand, which is a big producer of rice this year. You've heard about the flooding in Australia. I understand you've had tremendous flooding in parts of your country. Equally, we've got drought. Texas, I understand, it's got a drought. You've got a very large aquifer that spreads from Texas right the way up to the northwest. That's, a lot of farmers are going out of business. And pumping water from aquifers is both reducing your inherited reserve, so to speak, but it also costs money. I was quite surprised when I went to India and met a lot of small-scale farmers. And they've got two concerns. One is all their children don't want to work on the farm, so you can't get labor, and they're going to have to start trying to mechanize, but they only have a few $100s a year. The other is they're pumping up from aquifers 125, 200 meters down. They're having to go further and further every year. But a number of farmers in the village can club together and buy a pump for a few $100s. They get free electricity. How much longer? So people are starting to understand the genes. The link between diet and health, you've seen this before. The developing world, the major problems, you've got millions of deaths due to undernutrition. The developed world, millions of deaths due to overnutrition. You can see the reasons. As I said before, most of our common crops are not perfect with respect to their nutritional requirements of humans or animals. They're quite good for calories, but how can we improve others? Micronutrient deficiency, one example. Vitamin A, a friend of mine called Inga Patrikas developed this. Globally, depending on who you read, something like 670,000 children die every year because they are vitamin A deficient. 350,000 go blind. 90 million children in Southeast Asia suffer from vitamin A deficiency more than any other region. Iron deficiency is another, zinc deficiency. We now have ways of genetically, using GM, improving crops. Golden rice is one example. Represents the first example of a biofortified staple crop made possible by the application of recombinant DNA technologies. Conventional plant breeding won't work because there aren't the genes. So they took a gene from a daffodil and from a soil-borne organism, and they got golden rice. The person who developed this was Inga Patrikas, along with Peter Bayer. It's one of the ways forward. It wasn't going to make any money from anyone. It was first achieved in 2000. It was a public-private partnership between a company who gave all their technology free, and now it still hasn't been deployed for a whole variety of reasons. Hopefully it will be planted in 2013 in Southeast Asia. So how do we move forward? Well, given all the trends, the challenges you've heard about, we must try and find ways by expanding, not only not expanding, we're going to have to use sustainable intensification to increase the efficiency and the productivity of agriculture on the same area of land. Not only to combat man-made climate change, but to produce the food we need, the 70 to 100% increase. We must address population, affluence, and technology simultaneously as we move towards sustainability. We don't want to use just science and technology. That alone won't do. We've got to look at all technologies. We've got to look at the precise situation in the company that we're hoping to help. So we've got to use all safe, appropriate, socially responsible and sustainable opportunities to increase food supplies locally and also improve orphan crops. So it's the best of conventional plant breeding with the modern biotechnologies. So my key message is global food and nutrition security is under immense pressure. Technology has vast potential to meet not only global demands for food and nutrition, but also address emerging issues of sustainable energy and environment. The cost of bringing new technologies to the market continues to escalate. Genetics is expanding the paradigm of crop nutrition and pest protection to include a whole range of stress alleviation. A science-based, transparent, globally harmonized regulatory and trade policies are central for realizing this sector. One thing I want to talk about very, very briefly, and I know I've overshot my time, I'm sorry, is Northern Europe, because of the activity of a number of NGOs we'd all support in many areas, such as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, have decided that they are anti-GM. And this technology could have significant benefits in Europe and the rest of the world. But we're fat and we're overfed, so we perhaps don't need it. Food is far too cheap in Europe. It's 10 or 12% of our take-home. But you've heard in other parts of the world where it's anywhere between 70, 80 or 100% of your earnings, it's vitally important to achieve changes. There's a lot of anti-globalization, anti-capitalism, anti-multinationals, and dare I say it, even anti-Americanisms. What worries me is, as long as this scenario remains, its potential will remain unused in that part of the world where it potentially can be deployed at most. So we're starving the scientists in Africa and elsewhere because of our activities. Thank you very much indeed. I think I also have to tell you that in the box with these cookies, one is round and one is square. And I'm reliably told, but I haven't tested it, it's the square one that's GM. Did anyone notice the difference? Okay, so we've got two people. Was it better or worse?
I like the rounded one better. It seemed tastier.
Right.
And there was also more evidence, it might just be the way it was ground, of the kernels and whatnot.
Okay, so it may be the way it was made and not where it came from. Sorry.
Yes. There was a question.
I just want to say, I think you can't add too much sugar to both of them. And it took away from the form.
I didn't make them.
Well, we have a fascinating, challenging, and important presentation that you just made to us, and I tremendously appreciated that. And I couldn't help but think, is there, first of all, that question's here. I'll start, if there is, I'll be very happy. There are questions already, so I'll hold mine until later. Oh, and the balcony is first, please. Sorry.
Hi, Bob Gigigak, University of Pennsylvania. Is anyone in the GM community working on improving the photosynthetic efficiency of the crops on which we depend?
Yes, they are. As you're perhaps aware, in the plant field, there are two kinds of crops. There's something called C3 crops, which are things like soybean and wheat, and there's C4 plants like corn. C4 type photosynthesis, which relies upon many chemical reactions and proteins and genes and enzymes, is much more efficient than the C3. To engineer this, it won't be a single gene fix. It will be multiple genes. It involves changing the whole morphology and the anatomy of the plant. There are people working on this. At the moment, there's a lot more hype and hope than actual delivery, but people are looking at increasing photosynthetic efficiency. Unfortunately, plants are limited. The maximum energy conversion you can get is, on average, about 4%. So we might be able to improve it. The way in which you can improve yields is, and this is what Norman Borlaug's Green Revolution did, he bred plants using conventional breeding to produce plants which were much shorter. They put much more of what we want to harvest into the ear or into other things. He also made plants that were much more efficient at responding to high inputs of nitrogen fertilizers. So that was the basis. But people are working on photosynthesis and trying to improve it.
Yes, right here, please.
Michael Rabin, Cambridge, Massachusetts. You emphasized the role of NGOs and other misguided idealists in opposing GM in Europe. Can you also tell us if there are some serious scientists, and especially biologists, people, botanists, and such experts who have raised reasoned objections to GM?
Certainly. Normally, if I'd had an hour, I would have spent some time going into this. There are a number of us who are increasingly engaging in a dialogue, if possible with the NGOs, but many of them don't want to even talk. They have other visions. But we do engage, certainly with politicians and others, and try and put the balance in. Like anyone else, I believe that you should only use a technology if it's effective, if it's safe, and is a benefit to the people that you want to use. So increasingly scientists have got to talk to people. What worries me is a lot of the politicians, particularly in Europe, who've got a lot of other things on their plate, won't engage. You can't turn science on and off like a tap. To bring a crop from the early development to market takes 10 to 15 years. In the case of a GM crop, it costs about $130 or $140 million, which the regulatory costs. The regulation and biosafety laws around the world, apart from North America and parts of South America, are a real pain. So we've got a problem with regulation. We've got to sort that out. We must have a common regulatory problem. But this is but one way forward, and I'm very concerned that this technology we might not be using where appropriate.
There's a question right here, please.
Edie Tatel from Washington, D.C. Could you talk a little bit more about food safety? What about the allergic reactions to some of these modified foods? I believe the Brazil nut was one culprit.
First of all, someone took a gene from a Brazil nut to increase the sulfur content. At the earliest stage of testing, it was found that it was an allergenic protein. It was never sold. All the peer-reviewed papers in all the journals, and I was involved on the UK GM Science Review for 2 years with Sir David King, who some of you know was very interested in climate change as well. And from the review of the peer-reviewed literature, there are no health concerns. All the national academies, the European unions, everyone says this. GM foods are the most tested. And the thing about having the regulatory approach that we have in the biosafety, it means that a protein, of which many proteins are allergic, would not get into the food chain using the GM approach. Do you know what kiwi fruit is? Do you have it in this America?
Yes.
This was introduced into Europe and America from New Zealand, hence kiwi fruit, about 25 years ago. A significant percentage of the population is allergic to kiwi fruit. No one tests plants produced by conventional breeding or imported around the world. A lot of you eat exotic things. You've just eaten that insect. Has anyone tested that? I don't know.
The FDA, but still, it was halal and kosher. But that's a very important point, of course, all of these. Please.
Anna Meadows, Philadelphia. I think your talk and the problems of genetically modified foods brings up a really larger question, which is how can we educate people to understand science? And what are our social scientists doing to figure out ways to get past this problem of just ignorance that makes people not understand questions like this? So I think we need to speak to our educators and social scientists and maybe propaganda people to figure out a way to alter public opinion.
Thank you. I agree with you. I don't like the word propaganda. I'm not sure I like the word education, even though I've been in education all my life. I believe in dialogue, particularly in the free world. In other parts of the world, it probably doesn't exist. I helped, and I'm a founding trustee of something that we started in the UK, which is spreading to the US, called Sense About Science. So if you Google senseaboutscience.org, you will see it. One, we involve young people in that. Two, we take up a whole range of things. So I run things on making sense of the weather, making sense of GM food, little booklets, goes on websites. A lot of us go out and speak. So I spend a lot of my time talking to I spent 5 days in the Pontifical Academy talking about GM foods 2 years ago. I've talked to our synod of bishops. I've talked to politicians who are the most recalcitrant and ignorant, if we want to use the word ignorant, because most of them in our country have never had a proper job. And certainly many of them went to Oxford and Cambridge and didn't do science. So I would agree. But I think we've got to have a dialogue. It should start with small groups. And you should listen to what their concerns are. Because the word ignorance, you're scared of ignorant things. What does worry me is it's when we deprive other people of evaluating an agriculture, an improvement in agriculture in other parts of the world. The developing world will look after itself or not. The rest of the world, and time is not on our side. We've got to improve productivity using a whole variety. But dialogue is important. But the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, apart from the corruption, there's this lack of understanding. And actually, I've just got involved in a project funded by your Templeton Foundation based in Philadelphia, which is going to be working in Ghana and Tanzania to engage in dialogue with opinion formers, farmers, journalists, and so on, to talk about the technology and to evaluate.
Well, I think that's an important question. I think we have another one right here, please.
Mary Dunn of Philadelphia. Are there copyright issues about modified plants or plant genes which have an impact on their adoption, wide-scale global adoption?
Yes, this is one of, again, the NGOs are very concerned about ownership. I mean, Monsanto, Dow, Syngenta own the intellectual property invested in doing the GM crops. Well, unfortunately, we live in a capitalist society. They're not going to invest the hundreds of millions just to develop the technology and the hundreds of millions to get it to market unless it's going to make them money. People like Gates and many others, and many of the multinationals, are investing in transferring the technology to the developing world, particularly in these orphan crops. Because if it's not a tradable crop, the multinationals aren't interested. The slides I left out were that we've got to build public-private partnerships. The amount that we as a society in the UK and Europe and certainly in North America invest in improving agriculture by modern technology is very small. We've got to do public good plant breeding. We've got to do public good plant science. We've got to move together, as we heard earlier, between the public and private sector. If you think, I talked at the UN a few years ago, spent the whole afternoon, and all they did was say they'd all put money into sustainable agriculture and agriculture. I totted up. They promised a total of $54 million. How much was delivered, I don't know. And when I summed at the end, I said, do you realize that all the countries on earth who are members of the UN, and it was in the whole assembly, have just promised a total of $54 million to improve agriculture, sustainable agriculture in Africa. That's less than the cost of one fighter aircraft. That, to me, is obscene.
I think there are no other questions, and
Good.
I want to thank you so much
Pleasure.
for that challenging, important